Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Skill Up. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm a graduate learning specialist. I'm currently residing in the Academic Training Academy, and we help support our Skill Up series through the Graduate Studies Support Center. I'm very thrilled to have our academic program director for SCOE PhD programs, Dr. Quincy Daniels, joining us for today's Skill Up. And today, Dr. Daniels will be discussing an ethnographic approach to enhancing cultural competency in research. A couple of housekeeping items. We would absolutely encourage conversation in the chat, and we welcome questions in the Q&A. And if you would like to have scrolling subtitles, you can enable that at the bottom of your Zoom. So we welcome that as well. If you need me, you can find me in the chat. But I think that about covers it, Dr. Daniels. I'm going to pass this right on over to you.
All right, thank you. It's good to be here again. So, part of the things that I wanted to kind of share with people was some of the background information regarding certain things about ethnographies, kind of working with people that don't look like, act like, walk like, talk like, pray like you do, or what you're familiar with. So, the big important part of the takeaway here is that literally a lot of people are trying to understand exactly what an ethnography does because we don't typically do that here at this university, but I'm pretty familiar with it since I've done about 3. And it's really something that you will learn where they start talking about participant observation. And I'll be sharing some stories regarding that, which may be kind of funny, but I always say just bear with me on that because it's an important aspect to recognize how people are working with other people and acknowledging their differences and the similarities. And that's something that literally I guess I've kind of date myself on this since going back into the 60s. And when you have historical information, you want to go ahead and work with that. You want to go ahead and try to acknowledge people's experiences instead of erasing them. But that's another story. But I will kind of get busy as long as the technology works. And the first thing I'm going to do, let's see if sharing the screen works. That will be great. Dun, dun, dun. All right. That's pretty good. All right. So one of the things I want to also emphasize is like, where will we go from this presentation? So as we do that, it's just, I want to talk about what it is. I want to let you know about the person who created it, all the other things of really, why would we use it? Because the big thing about a lot of students or other people, other researchers, is that they go, oh, I want to be done. And an ethnography is not the most time-friendly research. Sometimes it can take 6 months, sometimes it can take many years. But the whole point is, it is an actual research method. So let's see, when and where and design, yes, we'll go over some of those. But majority of the things I want to get across is basically, as you get comfortable with other people who do not look like, act like, walk like, talk like, pray like you do, that's part of the their melting pot, as I would put it. All right, how we would conduct it, who's going to analyze this data, how to complete a report, do's and don'ts, and then I'll give you some interesting stories. All right, so as long as everything's working. All right, the ethnography is basically as a design method for human interactions. And one of the big points about why you want to do human interactions is that you have basically the behaviors that you see versus the behaviors that people tell you they do. Sometimes that disconnect happens in research. And as we've seen in a couple of things regarding research, what people say and what people do over a period of time, you'll see certain things. All right, so you want to observe. So this is that, I used to call it the forest for the trees. Many times we get so much data for students and things like this, like, oh my gosh, I've gotten through all the data collection, and now I've got just all this stuff that I need to have happen. And you're going, where do I start? Well, when we start working on a cultural context, it's like sometimes you have to go ahead and say, well, it's right there in front of me. I just didn't see it. And I really believe that's one of the things about where we are right now. Sometimes the information is right there. We don't see it because we're so busy trying to digest all of it. And then when somebody says, yes, this is it, I've moved all the extraneous material out, now I can actually see what's important. So when you do that, we call that the hidden obvious. And the hidden obvious, it's like it literally will hit you over the head and you'll be like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that? And sometimes it takes acknowledgement of what's going on where you go, uh-huh. After it's been pointed out, everybody goes, told you so. I knew that, if that sounds familiar. But as we continue, this particular methodology, was created by Bronson Manilewski in 1915. Now, think of the years that he's spending. Typically, he spent 3 years in what we call New Guinea today, but that's a lot of time doing participant observation. It's very interesting how much data you can see or gather while you're doing that. I look at it from a perspective like when people, I notice I have a few students, but if you could like put over in the chat how many months or how many weeks it took you to actually gather your data. Now imagine gathering your data for like 3 years. You're not doing anything else except gathering data. You're not putting in any opinions. You're just doing the data for 36 months. Some people go, nah, I want to be done. We used to with that old phrase, the best dissertation is a done dissertation. Well, one of the interesting points is that this is the current form of field work that you're doing or that you've already done. And that's where they draw on a lot of this information. All right. So with 3 types of data, which we'll go through, stories, narratives, myths, one of the major things about participant observation is that literally you're going to be a part of the process. Now, some people go, well, I want to stand back and observe. And that's all right depending on what you want to do with your particular style of research. But for myself, I wanted to be involved. I wanted to know exactly what was going on. So all these things developed, they had this idea about synaptic charts, which I won't bore you with, don't worry. But a lot of it can be used in any day-to-day, and I threw some in there regarding some information that they use for, say, logistics. That was just something I wanted to kind of just throw out there right now. But you'll see there's things that, I don't know if we have Star Trek people in here, but this is where my geek side comes out. The traditional version of an ethnography, I always equate that to Star Trek and the Prime Directive, cannot interfere, do no harm, things like that. So you want to know about the culture. You want to try to use the language as much as possible. And when I talk about my other story, it was not easy learning a new language. And that was even a quarter of it. You want to be objective. You want to compare the principles of society. No interference. That's the traditional way. And yeah, it really can take several years. But the other portion is that I had the one where I had the design and I wanted to use the local language, but it was subjective. And when I was doing that, there was a couple of things I wanted to get something done, accomplished, where we could actually say, this is what was needed, and here's what we're going to do. So it's an intervention based. And several weeks to several months seems shorter to me, as I really, at that particular juncture, wanted to be done. I think that's familiar with some of you. All right, so when you start looking at the ethnography, That's where I was talking about earlier. Things are not what they seem to be. Sometimes you'll encounter these people they call the gatekeepers, where you're not going to know when you're going to be allowed in, but you still keep showing up anyway. You still keep talking anyway. Um, Maybe the particular language that I'll go ahead and I won't tell you who or what, but it was not easy for the 2 or 3 months of me waiting to get to be a participant. So let me see if I remember a good phrase. The one where I was always introducing myself and I'm doing research. Kudlo no hua Quincy Daniels Zuzap Tao Nitspi Ko. So I had to learn a little bit. So it wasn't easy, but I had a 13-year-old who was very interested in trying to teach me her language. And that was something I was like, oh, I'm never going to get this. And she would laugh and go, yes, you will. It's like, because I'm a good teacher. I'm like, yes, you are. So let's keep going. But yeah, things like that, you have to learn a little bit. So it's a lot of it's effort based. And as you see with an ethnography, there's a few things about trying to work within the frame. All right. So the synthesis, the autobiography, one of the things about trying to figure out who the people are, what they are doing, is it important? Is there a challenge? Is there something going on? And you get to know them by actually spending time with them. Time is something that's pretty interesting. So you're going to do the observation, physical setting, environment, interactions, and what people tend to do. First 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks or whatever, the participant observer is just going to sit there and record and do the work and probably still not allowed access in. But somewhere down the time frame, people get used to you being in the close environment and real conversations start to happen. And if I was going to have to understand and translate, which is what I ended up having to do, it's like, what? I can't speak the language, but I can use translator applications after it was a long, convoluted thing. But I got information and people actually started talking to me. You have to understand that it's going to be a challenge getting inside. So, engagement, participants, long interviews, that's all part of it. Coding, that much information, yes, it was a challenge. And interpretation of data. Okay. So participant observations, field notes, things that you're really good at going through and understanding what you are seeing, because documenting what you are seeing. There was that old exercise, you take an apple, put it in your hand, it's like describe the apple. And a lot of people go, oh, round, red, stem, blah, blah, blah. Well, and then it may be interpreted differently for someone else. So that's what the challenge is like, can you accurately communicate? So field jottings, that's always interesting as you progress down these different activities. You may, okay, let me just jot down where we're going because that wasn't scheduled. And a lot of it is that you can say, okay, I just want to go here, but sometimes the research takes you out there. All right, so reflective field notes, I always call it closing out the day. It's like I've gone through, I saw the field notes, and then you're going to go ahead and say, okay, now it's kind of like just doing a summary of what you already did. So interviewing, I think everybody has an idea, structured, semi-structured, informal. Informal, I always say, is one that tends to work with an ethnography. That's the kind of the easiest one. And retrospective. All right. So as we start looking at some of the advantages and disadvantages, I put that up there because, some of the advantages, like, yeah, you're watering the crop is good. And some of the disadvantages, it's like Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, nothing's going to grow there. So you just have to understand some of the things that people face when they say, I'm committed to an ethnographic research. So, big thing, if you have like months of data, And the next thing you know, you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do with it? You have this big, rich, deep, comprehensive perspective. Recognize that you're going to be the subject matter expert on that because not many other people have done it. Now, it's one of the things that you'll see that about research topics is that once you're in it and you're a participant observer, you're going to be able to see these behaviors and you're going to find out what people are doing that made it appropriate and best suited over group behavior over time. And a lot of people have to make a decision regarding their amount of time they're willing to invest. So it's just part of the process. Of course, you have the disadvantages. Now, all of this is dependent upon how well you can do your observation and interpret what's going on. If you are not the greatest researcher in the world, it's like that's where you have to do a lot of catch up and study and be able to recognize. And we used to say, you're being able to tell the story of the people you're involved with. If you don't, then you're wasting your time. So numerical data, lack of it. So a lot of people go, oh, it's not valid. And I go, oh, yes, it is. You see, one of the things about being a scholar is that you're able to actually argue your points across the board. And a lot of the information that's particularly out there, especially for qualitative research, how much do you know? How did you get to know where you're going with your research? What are the steps that you have taken? Things like that that you're already familiar with. And it is a good, my idea, or at least some ideas, single situations usually observed leads to non-generalizable results. Heard that over and over. However, for the depth of the information that you get a whole lot more than the standard 2-4 weeks of data collection. And then you're trying to process that data. All right, ambiguity, yes. Variable in relationships are hard to define, yes. However, I still go back to the phrase of, if you have time to invest in it, it is a good methodology. All right.
Dr.
So as
Daniels,
we,
would you
got a
mind?
question.
I have two that
Oh,
have
okay.
popped up.
Okay.
I was hoping, and it's what you've just covered recently.
Okay.
The first one, if you don't mind, is where, so as you were doing as you're doing field notes, where
Mhm.
or how did you do that? I mean, what's your recommendation? I know you mentioned you do an end of the day recap, but were there certain strategies that were better for you? And where did you
Oh,
look
okay.
that information?
Yep. A lot of the field notes are standard. It's like, let's call it being descriptive. And anytime with like, okay, say for instance, went to the high school, observed the students in this particular course. You try to detail as much information because being older for me, my memory is about yay big. So I had to document and get experience at it. And here's the interesting point about field notes. The more you do it, the better you get. As you start, you can outline, okay, I want to know place, time, I want to know dress, I want to know things that are important to them. What was the behavior like? What was going on in the specifically in the area, like a classroom? What was all the things that you could actually document? And it would take pages if you're good at it. My first one, I was maybe a half page. By the end of all the data collection, I was doing 4 or 5 pages per individual because you grow in your ability to do the research and your observation ability grows as well. So it was just real specific on, you start with a process where you're kind of like, I'm still learning how to do it, but over a period of time, because that's the thing. Sometimes we rush, and I always say it's kind of like that crop thing. You can plant the seed, but you're not going to get to eat it for a while. So you have to grow a researcher. You have to actually get familiar and become an expert on how you're going to do your descriptions. And then from that point, when you start looking at all the data that you have, you just kind of break it down. It's like, okay, I'm going to break this part on behavior. Let's look at the first 2, 3 weeks. Was there something different that I can pull out that says this was occurring? And then you kind of just you work through the things that you could see. Physical setting. Was there something in this setting that you could see that became something that could be a pattern? So it's a process.
Thank
What
you.
was you had another one?
Yeah, I do. And there's one in the chat and another one that had come to me separately, but they are actually kind of related. The
Okay.
the one in the chat is, would you say it's more difficult or potentially not advised to conduct an ethnographic study on your own people, such as indigenous person? And then just think about that for a second. But next to that, do you address how you recognize your own bias in ethnographies later? Because I'm wondering if maybe those are connected.
Well, people can actually do whether they want to work within their own group or outside the group.
Okay.
I personally wanted to work outside the group because I had the 13-year-old child that actually came. It's like, well, you know, you're black, so why don't you just kind of like work with your own group? I'm like, well, being about 50, I think I've actually got that down. So I want to learn something new. I want to learn about your culture. I want to learn about things that, your parents do, your grandparents do, things that I have no experience in. That's
Okay.
my version of learning something new.
Okay, no, and I appreciate that. Yep, but not necessarily that it's like advised against per se. It's really up
Right.
to the researcher, right? Preference.
Correct. Hmm.
Okay. And then the bias piece, is that something that you touch on throughout, or can you address it a little bit now in terms of ethnography? Is there a specific place where
Right.
that occurs?
Well, I draw up a lot on the things that where they say if you have a bias, sometimes it can be media driven, and that you don't recognize that you're getting fed a lot of information to where you start making an assumption. And every time it would be something around bias or what people are able to do or what they're not able to do, you can actually close that out in your reflections and go, this is what I thought, and this is what happened. So you're actually making the comparison, you're acknowledging it. But like I said, it's very researcher based on that. And that's why people sometimes have a lot of challenges to an ethnography. They're like, well, if it's so researcher based, what if you find what you're looking for? It's like, no, you see, the one thing about participant observation is that there isn't a find what you're looking for. You're just with the group. So that's how I managed to protect it from that.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. There was something else that popped up in the chat, but I want to make sure we have time to move forward in the interest of time. So
Ah,
I'll take that at the next break. Is that all right?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great.
All right. I am going to talk a little bit about this Hmong experience because that's part of the things that I wanted to do. I wanted to understand, and it was always a challenge for me to understand. I came to the Midwest and I had literally no idea about the Hmong community, which basically said, oh my gosh, this is something new. And I really wanted to find out what was going on. And because I was an Upward Bound graduate myself, I thought, oh, okay, let's find out their perceptions of what was going on. And the biggest challenge that I found is that when you are doing real research, you got to be flexible. If other themes start showing up, you have to be able to, oh, hold up, let me make a little shift here. I might have to go and contact, my chair or whoever at the I go, I'm going to move this into a direction because these are the themes that are coming out. So the first thing I had to do was understand what I was actually trying to focus on because I was doing what you say, the perception, my own body. Oh, it's going to be all about Upward Bound. It's all going to be about Upward Bound. However, it wasn't necessarily all about Upward Bound. So the original intent, I wanted to find out a perception regarding the Upward Bound program. And as I went and worked with kids, that went out the door. Because that was the real intent of my research. It's like the elders that I spoke with, they said, if you're going to be here, you're going to tell our story. I'm like, I don't know if I could tell her right. It's like, then we'll make you wait and we'll have you learn and you'll have to do things with us. And I did not get invited in for months. I just kept showing up. Now, you don't know the outcome, you're just hoping, but there's a story to tell. So you have to see where you're going to go with it. So, as you probably can see, there's a lot more to people and their culture than what's we used to say like transform more than meets the eye. So that was one of the things that I ended up having to do, which was I had to somehow indoctrinate myself into the culture where people would say, well, you may be a little different, but we're going to be able to talk to you and work with you anyway. It doesn't happen easily. That's the one thing that I always want to impart to any student or anybody who's considering going into an ethnography regarding research. It's not going to happen easily. All right, let me get back to this. And I figure she'll keep me on track so I can know exactly what's going on. All right, so in going back and trying to understand the upward bound, this was my percent. I wanted to know more about school. And when I found a couple of things, is that it didn't exactly go the way I wanted to. And the things about how people were traveling, and a lot of the information about the Hmong community is that they were a community without a country, because essentially a lot of the things within, from China, um, started moving them quickly over to Laos, then moving them over to Thailand, and that was just to survive. So it's a challenge to tell the story the right way, but it wouldn't be. Um, it could go as far as a series course room class because you cannot do justice to that challenge over a 1 hour discussion. But essentially, the Miao ethnic groups and things like that, when people were trying to move and survive, there were genocidal actions. There were things that other people would not even comprehend. And we think that because we're over here in the United States, well, what's that got to do with us? And that's where the real idea of the structure and the research came forward. So, as I said, you had like 300,000 people are in the Laos area. And even then, there were still more things that were happening because of Vietnam that said, okay, because of the secret war, and that they were supporting the United States, when the United States left, there was a problem. And historically, we tend to see what happens when the United States pulls out, but that's a different story. All right, so the Secret War. This became an overarching theme that kept coming out. And I was asking one of the 13-year-old participants, it's like, so what do you like about the Upward Bound program? And they were saying, oh, it's a great program getting us ready for school, helping me understand. I want to do these things. But I have a challenge right now. I have so much fun with my friends and all this other stuff. But then when I go home, I have to go and do all the things that I'm supposed to as a member of the Hmong community. I was like, hmm. But that was like my first interview. I'm like, all right, whatever. So then I started talking to other person that started talking about, and I said, the secret war kept coming up. And they were like, okay, well, okay, what would you know? It's like, well, she said, I got here about 5 years ago. And as we were trying to get across and go back and move to the United States, my grandfather stepped on a landmine and he wasn't there anymore. And then I'd come over here and they want to have me just act like it's normal. So now we're starting to understand things about traumatic experiences and we're trying to make, accommodations for that. But you have a group of people that have segmented experiences that we weren't exactly accounting for in our school system. So it was a interesting process. So the culture does matter. History does matter. And what really brought it home to me, because I did this little trifecta where I'd go over to River Falls, and then I go to Milwaukee, and then I go to La Crosse, and I do my research up there to try to talk to the Hmong community. And it was not going to just be, hi, I want to go ahead and talk to your kids and da da. It's like, no, you're going to have to go and kind of work with us and see how long you want to be here. And we understand the intent is good, but unless you can actually tell our story at least a little bit correctly, we're going to just say, no, you don't really need to be here. But I kept showing up, and eventually, just like anything else, you're no longer the other, you're just another person who's around the area. And you can record and do all the other things as long as you've gone through and did the, you know, everybody else would know the participant sign here, da da da. But you have to really indoctrinate yourself into the culture. All right. Let's see. All right. Okay. Attempts. Yep. Okay. So here's one. I always do this for one of my sociology classes. When was the last time you were uncomfortable in being in a population that did not share your cultural experiences? That's an interesting point because I do the sociological construct where we'd go through and it's like, hi, you know what the most segregated day of the week is? Sunday. So I'd have my other students go to a church or synagogue or anywhere else that they've never been to and that they would absolutely be the minority in the room. Perspectives change when you're no longer the majority. So that was just one of the things. But has there ever been a time that you've ever experienced something like that? Now imagine being taken from your home of record to overseas and you're plopped in, if you're farming and that's your experiences, why they would put you in the cold of Wisconsin and Minnesota is beyond me, but yeah. But actually did very well and things, or as far as farming and things like that. I can say that we live about 4 miles from Long Community. So I can be a little biased on that part. All right. So uh, this is one of my examples. Okay, I get to visit a Hmong community, did my request, got through the gatekeeping, and over a period of time, they're like, he's just going to keep showing up. And he really wants to know, and he's really reading our books, trying to understand about Colonel Vang and things like that, and he's working on it. So some of the children who are like, I can see you're having difficulty here, and they would come over and they'd say, you need to like do it this way. And took me through the community centers. And from accessing the community centers, I was more accepted. Now, and then we started going to the Hmong New Year with my entire family, and we do that every year now. And it's just something that once you've expanded your mind, it never goes back to the original dimensions, something like that, that they like to say. But finally, I was getting in, and that was really important because after that, I was spending a lot of time everywhere. All right. Engagement with others is a major point because if you're going to, you can be an observer, but you're going to have to be a participant observer. And like I said, once we started about that 9th week, it could have been 10, but I think it's 9. Said, here, you want to have a feast? You want to be a part of it? I'm like, oh, finally. And I was really happy. I'm going, okay, this is going to be great. I'm finally accepted. I'm going to be able to do more research, blah, 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 blah. And I'm looking off and I'm like, graduation, and things like that. And I was like, okay, we got this down now. This is like just in the chat. It's like, what's your idea of a feast? Because the feast I thought I was going to be like, yes, this is really good. And I'm going to be able to sit there and eat and converse and blah, blah, blah. I had little idea of what was going to happen next. So food was really good. Things were really great. Got to meet a lot of people. But before we could get to there was some interesting things that I had to do as a participant observer. All right, got through the gatekeeping and I got invited. And there was this thing with the rite of passage for some of the teenagers. And I'm going, all right, I'll just sit back here, wait for you to come back, and we'll all sit back. And they're like, oh, hold on. We're not going to do that. I'm like, what? Why? They're like, well, we want to go out to the woods and we're going to get a boar and we're going to do whatever we need to do with the boar. We're going to come back and we're going to cook it and eat it and all that. And you're going to help. Yeah, that was a little bit worried about that because I'm like, I'm used to engaging from my old military background, engaging as far out as possible. We were not engaging as far as possible. So it was a little nerve wracking for me to go through, but we did what we needed to do. And I was looking at these little small children taking care of business, and I'm just like, they're like, yeah, that's what we do. I'm like, okay, I'll be back here because oh, it was large. It was large and it was aggressive, and I'm just going, this is going to really be bad if something doesn't work right. But no, very well prepared. And I was like, okay, I've managed to get through this. Okay. But if you're not willing to understand the intent of the people that you are working with, it's not going to work. I'll say it again. If you're not going to understand the intent of the people you're working with, it's not going to work. And I wanted it to work very badly. So it was just one of the things that I had to go ahead and overcome my being uncomfortable. And any type where you're going to be a participant observer, you will be uncomfortable. And you can't bring in, well, why don't we do this way? You know, because we do it this way over here. You got to throw that away. It doesn't work. All right. So something became clear, and I touched on it earlier as I finally got to start doing interviews, is that the secret war was still continuing. The things about the traumatic experiences of trying to get over from Laos and Thailand over to here was continuing. And we don't talk about it. We don't do a whole lot of information about, well, because they supported the CIA and all this other stuff, and they helped us. So we said, okay, well, because you helped us, we're going to have you be able to resettle over here since genocidal actions were going on. And my 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds and things like that, they were telling me this over and over, and it was within their lifetime experiences. So it is not exactly history. Okay. All right. Anyway. Um, but yeah, there was another thing that jumped out, and that was that this problem of, I wouldn't say a problem, but they had to do, especially for the among females, they had to be American at school, but there were certain responsibilities of being Hmong at home. And we used to say, given two generations, there is a major challenge regarding language, uh, historical activities that are supposedly passed down. And eventually, if you keep losing that, you lose your history. That is a challenge. That is something where it got really personal to me in the last administration. It said, well, we want to send them back. In the United States, we can do better than that. But that'll get my, as they say, get my goat every time. For the people that helped and believe that we're going to do things here, we actually had some people that wanted to have legislation to send the Hmong back. So it was quite personal to me. I know it was personal for them, but you see, if we can't understand and be upset about the experiences of others that are similar to ours, then we're not doing the research. And that is the one thing I want to get clear is that it you're changed by what you find out. And that part of the things that I call it bringing full circle, is that the experiences always related back to the travel to get here. So within the travel to get here, I'm thinking, okay, well, we got to be able to do this right. We have to tell the story right. We have to get more people involved. And a lot of it really is conditional regarding, well, let me make sure I don't go into my little standard where I'll just start lecturing. There's a way of doing qualitative research, which I said, yep, I'm going to follow and do the steps and do all that. But I found that I was getting more um, connected. And the thing about ethnography is that you can do that, but you have to recognize it. All right. So over a period of time, the challenge of speaking in front of the observer, things like that. And I'll go back and tell you about the same thing. Time invested, it's important. Things like that do matter. So that's why I always say that's why I like the idea of an ethnography. And I already showed you the video. So, I'd say about 11, 12 years ago, the theme that came up was that we had to do this thing called the Hmong acculturation theory. And within that context, it's just basically the idea that when you are exposed to a new culture, a new community, individuals from one culture come into continuous direct contact with another culture, it affects the social, emotional, psychological, cultural well-being of that person. And if everything is telling you, be like us, and you're a child, it's hard not to be like us. So you want to go ahead and do as much as you can, but then you also are losing culture. You see, I, being the genealogy person that I am, I do this stuff on Ancestry and 23andMe and all this other stuff. And I cannot tell you one thing after just before the Civil War. Because for me, the hard stop is right there. Everything about my culture has been removed. We're slowly getting the information in. And this is one of the things I said, are there similarities? Are there differences in our communities? If you want to retain your history, you have to know your history. Okay, enough of my high speak, as I call it. All right. Hopefully I'm on time, Emily.
You're doing great, Dr. Daniels, honestly, in terms of time.
Okay, really good. All right. So we'll go ahead and open that back up for questions.
Yes, and we actually do have a couple of that have popped up, and just also just in general, a comment. Thanks for sharing this moving and inspiring story. Couple of good comments in the chat. I do have two questions. Let me scroll on up. And this has to do with the, I guess, the interview process for ethnography. Maybe you can kind of break this down a little bit more for us, but um in an ethnography, is there a formal interview point, or is it just learning as you are within the culture, just experiencing through that? Is there a formal interview? I guess I'll say with that.
You can do a formal interview, but I strayed away from that because I wanted to find out. That's kind of more preconceived of what would be important. So, in being a participant observer, it's like, okay, as I'm with them for months, I could say, okay, well, this seems to be something I'd be interested in learning more about. So
Ah,
you can structure your questions, but you also I had to get this like permission to do this from the university side. It's always, well, we want to know what your questions are. I'm like, well, I can't tell you until I'm there and I'm experiencing it with them.
okay.
And that is the big challenge with researching when they say, well, you were making questions up on the fly. It's like, yes, but the questions were important.
Okay. And so in your experience with your ethnography research, how did you record those types of responses? So say something was of interest to you and you're like, I'm going to ask some questions about that. How did you then record it so that you could make sure that you were
Oh,
representing it
every,
accurately?
right. Everything. I must have walked around with 5 different voice recorders. Everything was always on a transcript after I had to go and have it, and I just
Okay.
had just of paper of the translation. And then I go back and it's usually like I tell my other student, you go back and member check. And it's like, hey, is this is what you said? And it's like, yep. And half the time I would say whenever I'm dealing with elders, it's like, okay, we're going to record this, then we got to translate it, then we got to go ahead and then go back and check. And they were like, well, the same reasoning. It's like the reason we are telling you this, we want you to tell our story accurately. If you cannot tell your story accurately, then you need to leave. And I'm like, okay, pressure. And I
A
remember the
little
one
bit.
thing, I remember the one thing about I was getting ready to graduate, and of course I did the little invite as many people over to my graduation as possible. And that one that really like she rode herd on me like the entire process. She did not take her eyes too much far off of me. She gave me part of the storyboard cloth, and I carry it this day.
Mm.
And it's just one of the things that I keep it. Well, I actually took it out, but I wanted to make sure that people understand it. It's meaningful. It's something that people do. And when you're able to present and tell the things about the Secret War and the traumatic experiences, and that we're not really paying attention to it in the school systems, that's a problem that we need to address. And that it wasn't it wasn't too long ago that people called for their removal.
Dr. Daniels, thank you so much for bringing this topic to us and shedding some light on ethnography studies. And we appreciate you and your expertise. And I hope until the next time, everybody does have a good rest of their day.
Okay, thank you for being here.
Take care.